I'm gonna record on my computer, and then I'm gonna mute everybody. And so just to try this, so just realize if you want to ask a question at any time, just raise your hand, and we'll be monitoring for that. Okay. So many of you I already know, and so you've already heard my rundown of who I am and what I do. But basically, I'm the Chittenden County Forester. The County Forester program has been around since about the 40s. And the goal of the County Forester program is to help landowners manage their private land better. And so Vermont's forests are, we're about 75% forest, and about 80% of those lands are privately owned. And those lands are producing massive public benefits. So they're cleaning our water and our air, and they're sequestering and storing carbon, and they're providing habitat for all of our wildlife, and they're providing these amazing recreational opportunities and economic opportunities, and most of them are owned by people. And so it's really, really important that we give people the tools to manage their forests really well. And so even though that amounts to millions of acres of privately owned land, there are, at present, I believe, 13 of us for Vermont's 14 counties. And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of different things that we do. I say that it's basically 4 parts. The first part is that we manage the current use program. So the use value appraisal program, or UVA program is its technical name. And that is a tax abatement program for landowners that own more than 25 acres of forested land. And you can enroll in the program. Every 10 years, you have a forest management plan that's developed by a professional forester. It's approved by the county foresters, and it's monitored by the county foresters. So that's a big part of our work, and that's a really amazing tool to help people manage their land better, and also to incentivize keeping forests as forests and not just becoming developed. And so the second part of my job is that if you're a forest landowner with forests of any size, I'll just come out to your property and talk to you about how to manage it and what the opportunities are and what's going on. From a couple of acres to a couple thousand acres, it doesn't matter. We're just a free resource for Vermont landowners. The third part is that all county foresters assist in the management of town forests in their county in some way. Depending on the county, it can be more involved or less involved. I really, really like working with town forests, and I've done some pretty big projects with the town forests in my county because I'm really, really excited about them. I think they're really cool. And the fourth thing that I do is sort of where we get to be creative. And so that is just addressing the question of how do we make forests healthier and elevate the quality of forest management in our county. And so that's the one where you sort of, it draws upon those other 3 things, because of course we're advising landowners about how to manage their land and how to help their forest be healthy all the time. But you also get to be creative, and you get to, think about the different opportunities and the different threats that different counties have, and how to sort of uniquely address what's going on and tailor it to your specific county. And so in that vein, I've been really excited about, especially recently, doing some demonstration forest management work at the Heinsberg Town Forest, and a couple of years ago at the Preston Pond Conservation Area in Bolton, and just trying to get people engaged and get people excited about forests and forest management. And so between those things, that's pretty much the role of county foresters. And if you asked each county forester, they would each give you a different answer, probably. But it's this sort of really neat, flexible, and also really important job. And so with that, if any of you guys want to raise your hand, I would be happy to just keep on talking to myself. But if you guys have any questions, raise your hand and I'll see if I can answer them.
Ethan, I answered it in the chat box, but we had a question of, do you still do site visits right now?
So, not right now. And the reason for that, so actually, under the order that we have right now, forestry and logging and primary forest processing, so mills and stuff like that, are considered essential services. So foresters and loggers are exempt from that order, and they're still allowed to work. As state employees, the county foresters have a different standard, and so we've been told basically not to do site visits until the order is over. And so I'm still doing, obviously I'm still working, but not able to visit with landowners on their land right now. But hoping to get out and do that pretty soon. Oh, I got a hand. Sherry Lynn, what's up?
Hey, so do you have a recommendation that, like, because we're trying to get out and do exercises because we're going nuts being inside all the time, is there something that we can do right now before site visits are possible, you know, like a little checklist or something?
Yeah, jumping jacks.
Yeah.
So one thing, so there's a whole bunch of different things, and obviously, like, one of the most important things you can do on your land at any time is just to go and walk around and look at stuff. I had this amazing forestry professor, John Shane, in forestry school, and he used to say, he would be like, you guys ever see this thing? And everybody would be silent, and then he'd be like, you need to go out and look at stuff. And so I learned a lot just by walking around and getting to know your land, you know, on a piece of, whether it's your land or a piece of public land. It doesn't, you know, visiting it, different parts of your land and sort of taking a different route and going in different seasons, you see something different every time you go out. And I think just being curious, you can learn a lot that way. The other thing that I would say is that this is a really, really good time, not right now, but very shortly, will be a very, very good time to map where invasive exotic plants are on your property, like buckthorn and barberry and multiflora rose and honeysuckle. So all those plants are going to leaf out before pretty much all of our native species. And so there's a thing that happens, especially like in April and early May, where I call it the green haze, where you can look out through the understory of your forest and you see all this green in the understory. And what that is it's those invasive exotic plants leafing out. And so it's a really good time to walk around because it can give you a better sense of where they are and the extent of the problem. So the same thing is true in the fall. So they will also retain their leaves longer than most of our native species. And you can sort of go out and map during that time. And it might be that while you thought that there were only a few of them, there's actually a lot. And so the common invasive plants that you're probably looking for in that context would be shrub honeysuckle, common buckthorn. If you're in the southern part of the state, more glossy buckthorn, although I have some of that on my property in Bolton as well. Multiflora rose, Japanese barberry, oriental bittersweet. And you can find fact sheets on how to identify all of those species at vtinvasives.org, which is a state-maintained website that has all kinds of information about all kinds of invasive exotic species. And I'll bet you that Lisa is typing that into the chat box right now. There she is. All right, how about Jeanette? You got a question? Oh, you got to unmute yourself, Jeanette, or maybe I can unmute you. You're here. Oh, there you go. There you go. Ahead, Jeanette.
Hey, everybody. So on the invasives, if we spot them, what should we do? Is there something we can do with them now? Like pull them up or cut them or?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, and this is like a whole, if you want to start talking about invasives, it sort of is like a whole bigger conversation, but
No.
Yeah, I know. But this is actually, so this is a good time to be doing mechanical work. So usually the soils are wetter. It's easier to pull them out. What I say with invasives, you know, and so if you're going to pull these species out, you want to pull them out. You want to get every single piece of the root system. And you probably want to, you know, it just depends on the scale of what you're doing. If it's in your yard, it's very easy to remember where they are. But if you're out in the woods, the chances are you will not remove that entire root system when you pull it up, especially if it's with a big plant. And so hang a piece of flagging tape or something that will remind you to come back there because it's going to resprout. Almost all those invasive plants are really, really good at staying alive and resprouting from even tiny pieces of root fragment or even sometimes stem. You know, they say that Japanese knotweed, which some old timers around here call bamboo, that it can sprout from even like an inch of stem. And so just remembering where you've done that pulling will go a long way, because then you can find that area again, and then you can pull them out when they resprout from those root fragments. I say that invasive treatment is usually a capacity issue, meaning that mechanical treatment, so with many of these species, unless they're like a couple of plants in your yard, cutting them does not work. With buckthorn especially, I'll say it just makes it mad. And you can keep on cutting. You'd probably have to cut an individual plant several times a growing season for many years on end, and most people just can't or won't do that. With smaller plants, you can pull them up by hand. With bigger plants, what we're realizing is that we can use herbicide in this really like targeted minimalist way that doesn't negate negative impacts of the use of herbicide in agriculture and other uses, but is really, really targeted, really minimal, and makes it so that when you kill those plants, you actually kill them. And so an example of this is I have this amazing tool that many of you in Chittenden County have seen called the Buckthorn Blaster, which is an application tool. You can buy it on the internet. It's $6. It's a modified bingo dauber. It's a 4-ounce container with a little sponge applicator tip. It doesn't spill. It uses like the minimum amount of herbicide possible. And what you'll do is cut the plant and then just dab that herbicide on the surface of the stump. And then, if you're like on a property like mine in Bolton, where I have 30 acres of wall-to-wall invasives, I don't have time to try and pull them all out by hand, which is more physically intense, takes like 10 times as much time, and then come back and do it again and again and again and again. I've actually solved the problem. And with these invasives, there's such an existential threat to forests that even though the use of herbicide, I think in many cases represents sort of like a philosophical compromise, it's worth it. It's, the impacts, especially if we're talking about this like super, super minimal targeted use of herbicide, the impacts of the invasives far outweigh the negative impacts of that herbicide. So I'm really excited about it. And I think that forming sort of a pragmatic approach to dealing with invasives in a meaningful way that's actually going to address the problem on a landscape scale will require the use of herbicide. And it makes people really uncomfortable, but it's actually, that's sort of what makes it so radical. Doing it is saying, wow, this is a thing that's really serious. I recognize that it's uncomfortable, but also I recognize that dealing with this bigger problem in the context of a landscape-wide forest ecology that is massively threatened by invasive plants is really, really more important. So that said, this is not a great time of year to do that. So you can do it almost any time of year. So that type of herbicide application specifically, where you cut the stem of the plant and dab the herbicide on the surface of the stump, that's called a cut stump application. And the spring is basically the only time that you can't do it. And the reason for that is because you want the plant to draw that chemical down into its root system. And right now, if you were to cut the surface, you cut most plants, you're going to see sap bubbling up out of the root system, and it'll just push the herbicide right out of the plant. And so, they say that the best time to do that is August, September, late summer. But you can do it anytime. And basically, we have so many invasives that I treat invasives on my land all year round, except for like March, April, May.
So Ethan, there was a quick question, and some people may like the answer or not. Want the answer to this. Did they need a license to apply it on their own land? Andrea actually answered it. Thank you, Andrea, in the chat box, that you don't need a license to apply herbicide on your own property unless you are doing it with a government funding like EQIP.
Yeah.
There's
the other thing. The other thing I would say about that is that another thing that you can do. So like, let's say that you have like a really advanced invasive species population on your land, and you're like, wow, this is going to take more than me going out on the weekend and working for a couple hours to solve this problem. There is a course that's offered by the Agency of Agriculture. It's a day-long course. It's to become a certified pesticide applicator. Basically, they teach you in the morning, and then you take the exam in the afternoon. That's what I did. And it's open to land. I know landowners who have done it, and I think it will make them more comfortable with that technology. But you don't need a license to apply on your own land. And there are specific herbicides that you can buy without a license. So the herbicide that I recommend in almost every case is glyphosate, which is another hard thing because that's the active ingredient in Roundup, the most widely used herbicide in the world. And, you know, obviously has been under fire for a bunch of other reasons. But the reason that we use it and that pretty much every conservation organization in Vermont advocates for and uses that herbicide and herbicide in general on these invasive exotic plants is that it's by far the most environmentally benign herbicide that we have. So it's doesn't get into groundwater. It bonds very strongly to soil particles, so it doesn't leach. It breaks down very quickly. It is relatively inert in the landscape. It doesn't have any soil activity. So once it gets down into the soil, it's not going to kill plants through the soil or anything like that. It's actually a pretty, you know, as far as those things go, it's actually a pretty neat tool to have used correctly. And so you can just get that. You can get it at Tractor Supply or Home Depot. I don't know where you can get it right now, but but you can get it at Tractor Supply or Home Depot or Lowe's or Agway. All right, who we got? Kim, you want to ask a question? Kim Coleman.
Yeah, it's actually Nico's question. Do you remember what you wanted to ask?
No.
Did you forget?
Mm-hmm.
What's the bug called that you were curious about?
I forgot.
He wants to know what EAB does, and he doesn't trust me to answer him.
Oh, okay. So EAB, the emerald ash borer, is an insect from Asia. It is what we call an invasive exotic insect. So it's not from here, Nico. It's from a different part of the world. And it is a big threat to our ash trees. And so it basically is moving through our landscape right now. I don't know how many states it's in currently, 30-something of our states. And what it does is it lays its eggs in the bark of ash trees. As those eggs hatch, they form larvae, and the larvae move through the trunk of the tree, eat the inner bark, and that inner bark of the tree, that outer area between the wood and that outer bark is where the tree transports all of its nutrients up and down the stem. So they eat all that, and the tree can't get its nutrients up and down the stem, and so it dies. And so in Vermont, you know, we have ash trees. We have a lot of them. We say it's about 5% of our total forest, or total trees in our forest. So 1 in 20 trees. But that is not to say that in other portions of our state, it's not very highly populated. So like on some of these sites where there's a lot of sugar maple and basswood, what we call like an enriched northern hardwood site, it would be like often 20% of all the trees. So 1 in 5, which is a lot. If you go out to the Lake Champlain Islands, after the news hit that we had emerald ash borer for the first time in the state, I went out and rode around Grand Isle County, and looking at the amount of ash there is startling. It's mostly green ash and black ash. We have 3 native species of ash: green, black, and white. And it's scary. And so, you know, there's a whole bunch of different stuff we can do about it. You know, we don't think that we're gonna stop it. We think that it's probably gonna sort of move through the state and kill most of our ash trees, but we know that some small amount of them are resistant. So some small amount of them, the EAB does not kill the tree. It's low. It's like, you know, we don't have great research on it, but the research we have suggests it's about 0.5%, but that those trees are concentrated. So there's something that's called, they're called lingering ash trees, you know, sort of like ash tree that's overstayed its welcome. And they are just able to persist in the infested landscape in small populations sometimes, where their survivalship will be very high. And so the management to manage for emerald ash borer is really complicated. Basically amounts to harvesting some ash trees, especially if landowners are concerned about, you know, they've been growing these trees for a long time and concerned about the loss of value in those trees and the amazing resource that ash wood is. But then also, the last thing we want is to lose this tree from the landscape. And so every tree, you know, forests are these massively complex dynamic systems. And every native species has a role in that system. And you can sort of quantify what those are. You can just sort of understand that it's really, really complicated, and that each tree is really, really important. And we've seen through the history of our region that there have been numerous losses of tree species. We still have elm trees in our landscape, but they don't grow like they used to grow. They get to a certain size, reproductive maturity basically, and then they die from Dutch elm's disease. American beech is very similar. American beech has beech bark disease, and we know that prior to European settlement, a huge portion of our forests were dominated by American beech, like 40 to 60% of all of our trees were American beech, and they don't grow that way anymore because there's a invasive exotic disease called beech bark disease, a disease complex that afflicts them. And similar, the chestnut blight. We used to have American chestnuts in some parts of the state, and it was very prominent in southern parts of our state. And we don't have it anymore as a result of an invasive disease. So we can't continue to keep on losing pieces of our forest like that. And especially when we anticipate that stressors, invasives, and other things will become more prominent as our climate changes, and becomes more fragmented, and all these other things that are happening. And so we need to protect the species ash. And so that's really, really important. And so what we're doing is actually, in many cases, we're trying to regenerate ash. Even though that seems really counterintuitive, we're trying to create a lot of diversity in our ash populations by, while we harvest some ash, also trying to create conditions where ash can regenerate and we can get a lot of ash. We're also trying to prepare ourselves for what happens when many of those larger ash trees die. So what you can do in that case is that you can deal with your invasive exotic plant infestation that's in the understory of your forest. So if you have a lot of ash and you have invasives in your understory, what's going to happen when those ash die is that you're going to release those invasives and they're going to become more prominent. And so dealing with that ahead of time is really important. Another thing that you can do is that we're recognizing that in a lot of parts of our state, we have an overpopulation of deer. And deer, through browsing, eating, especially in the wintertime, the buds and twigs of small trees, they really, really like to eat ash trees. And so where you have an overpopulation of deer, it's very difficult to regenerate ash as a species. And so what we're realizing is that the hunting of deer is also tied into this. So, and we know that what challenges the hunting of deer in Vermont is a couple different things. Posted land, people who have their land posted, we know that deer will often congregate in areas of posted land throughout the season, basically just moving from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure throughout the hunting season. And we know that our hunter numbers are declining dramatically. And in a landscape where we are the predator of this species, essentially, that's really problematic. We know that we have half the hunters now that we had in the 1970s, and we're expected to have half the hunters that we have now in 10 years based on demographics. And so there's, in order to, sort of this roundabout way to save the ash, it's really important that we think about how we manage our deer herd as well. And so what I recommend for people who have posted land and are really, really uncomfortable with completely not posting their land is that they post their land by permission only and allow a couple trusted people that they know and that they can communicate with on their land to hunt it. And that can be a really cool relationship because they can be like another set of eyes on your land, another steward of your forest. And we also need to sort of engage different young people in the act of hunting, people who maybe are not part of our like traditional hunting coalition. And so all that is just a roundabout way to say that emerald ash borer is a really big deal. There's, I could talk probably endlessly about this sort of our nuanced approach to it, but the goal is maintaining ash as a species on our landscape. Oh, so last thing I'll say is that there are opportunities to treat ash. So basically you can inject them with a systemic insecticide that will kill the emerald ash borer in the tree. And if you do that like every 2 years, you will keep that tree alive or keep it from being killed by emerald ash borer. It could still die of the other stuff that kills trees. But there are some recommendations on Vermont's Urban and Community Forestry website, which is, what is it? VT Community Forestry, Lisa? We'll put the link in the in the chat box there. But there are some recommendations on people who are applying those insecticides, and then also the different chemicals that we recommend, because there's a couple different options. Not all of them are the best. So that it's cheaper, like that you get into this whole other wormhole when you start talking about what we're going to do about with the ash, not just in our forests, but also like in our yards and along our power lines and along our rural roads and stuff like that. But treating them is cheaper than taking them down in many cases initially, but you got to do it every 2 years. And so it adds up. It's probably for most people not something that you can do with a huge number of ash trees, but you can do it with some. And so what we recommend is sort of identifying those really important, culturally important ash trees, like a big charismatic ash in your town green or in your yard or something like that. And just know that that's going to be something we're expecting emerald ash borer to persist on the landscape sort of indefinitely. And so that's going to be something that you're going to have to continue to do, is treat those trees.
So there are a few questions that relate to ash before we move on to another topic. I'm going to read through all of them, and so if I need to repeat any, let me know.
Yeah.
Micah wants to know, are there any particular contributions of ash trees to forests that we'll be losing? Are there any specific ways our forests will change for losing so many ash trees?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Andrea can type in a little bit too. What silvicultural treatments encourage ash regeneration? Someone else wrote, we have a number of young ash trees on our property, still small enough to be movable. Is there something we can do to protect them or give them additional time?
Yeah. Okay. So the last question first. I don't think there's, I mean, no. I don't know that there's anything that you can do to sort of protect those trees physically, I guess. Maybe you could put like a really fine bug net around them, and the emerald ash borer would never get there. But I think that the treatment, the chemical treatment, is sort of our first option. And those trees are, my guess would be that they're too small to treat, because it requires like drilling a hole sort of at the root collar and injecting them in there. So I don't think that there's anything to be done about that. As far as so going back to the first question, so what are we losing when we lose ash? There's sort of like a short answer and a long answer. So with many of these tree species, you can kind of like pull apart, like it's good, it's used by this species, it's good for this thing. We know, for instance, that that ash is a really important nutrient cycler in these rich northern hardwood communities. So with all that's just a fancy way of saying basically that ash pulls up soil minerals, dissolved minerals from the soil. So there's minerals that are deep down in the soil from the bedrock that are basically being sucked up into the ash tree with the help of associated root fungi, being sucked up into the ash tree. They deposit it in their leaves. Some other trees do this, basswood trees do this as well, deposit those minerals in their leaves, and then when the leaves drop, those minerals are, instead of being way deep down in the soil, they're at the surface of the soil. So they're actually enriching, sort of like over a long period of time, moving these deeply seated soil minerals up into the surface of the soil. So ash trees do that, and sort of, they perform many very specific roles. So they have deep bark crevices, which are probably used by our bark foraging bird species, and they probably perform many different, very specific roles for specific species. But what I would say is that they are just a part of these really complicated forest communities, and they do stuff that, they have connections and do stuff that we probably don't even understand. They fill a very specific role, especially in relationship to some of those other tree species that I've mentioned that they often grow with. So in the case of, and I guess I'm talking about white ash. In the case of white ash, which is an upland species, white ash is sort of this mid-tolerant, so it's sort of tolerant of shade and it's sort of not tolerant of shade. It grows very quickly, and so it sort of occupies this very specific role in that system, whereas a tree species like sugar maple grows more slowly, and so it just sort of fills a unique role. And I don't know what other species in that system would fill that role. Maybe some of our other native species would. But I guess what I would stress is just sort of thinking about, instead of taking a tree-focused approach, taking a forest focused approach and thinking about sort of all of these pieces as being integral as part of this really complicated system. And as far as silviculture for regenerating ash species, we know that ash is, so I said it's sort of a mid-tolerant species. So it's sort of tolerant and it's sort of not tolerant. And actually, UVM forestry professor Tony D'Amato, who's an amazing resource to our community, he told me, he said that's a compromise or an averaging of actually two completely different shade tolerance capacities that white ash has throughout its life. So when it's a young tree, it's very, very tolerant of shade. So it's one of these species that we call like an advanced regeneration dependent species. And what that means is that it regenerates in advance of a disturbance. So other species that do this are like red oak, sugar maple. And what they do is they drop their seeds. They have relatively large seeds, which is a little energy packet for the seedling that they create. And so they drop these seeds, the seeds germinate and sprout in the understory of the forest, and then the seedlings just wait there. And in many cases, so this is when they're very, very shade tolerant. So they can wait there for like decades, and they're just existing in the understory of that forest, being very, very tolerant of shade and just feeding off a deep taproot that was established by sort of accessing the resources in that seed that they originally had. And then if a tree falls over, or if a disturbance comes and a bunch of trees fall over, those species are already established and they have this really good root system, and then they just sort of work their way up into the overstory of the forest. So they are very shade tolerant at that point. As an older tree, they are very intolerant of shade. And you can actually infer on many of our native tree species how tolerant of shade they are by where they keep their branches. So if you have a species like white ash or like aspen, poplar, same thing, white birch, you'll notice that they only have branches right at the very top of the tree. And that's because they're very intolerant of shade. They're not able to sustain those branches that are lower down in the tree. Whereas if you take a species like American beech, you'll often see branches, even on a large tree, all the way to the ground. And that's just because they're very, very, very tolerant of shade. So as it's older, it's intolerant of shade. What we know about the silviculture of regenerating ash is that you can do it in a bunch of different ways. The short answer is that you have to create a bigger opening, so like a quarter of an acre, where you cut all the trees. Most of the silviculture work that I do, so silviculture is just a term for the textbook terminology that's like drilled into my brain, is it is the art and the science of tending the forested stand. And I still remember, like, in forestry school being at a bar and with my forestry buddies, and one of them calling out and they're like, Ethan, what do you think? Silviculture, art or science? Just like a big joke that we had. So anyway, so the silvicultural, the easiest way to regenerate ash is to create these openings. But what we do is using principles of what we call ecological forest management. It's also called new forest management. We're trying to regenerate and manage forests in a way that models how forests manage themselves. So instead of saying we're so smart, we know how to manage forests, we're going to manage them, essentially just for our needs and what we think looks good and what we think the way that makes sense to do it. Instead, we're taking a step back and saying, how do forests manage themselves? What do old growth forests look like? How are we going to emulate those conditions across the landscape? And so what that looks like is not a neat and tidy forest, but in many cases a forest that appears messy, complex, irregular. And part of that is by creating these, not just thinning the forest and not just making the trees have, perfect spacing like in a plantation or like it's, carrots in your garden or something like that, but allowing that irregularity to persist and creating openings, which are essentially, we call them groups, and they're essentially modeled after small scale natural disturbances. And so the textbook name of the silvicultural treatment that I would prescribe in many cases would be like a group selection, where you're harvesting all the trees in these pockets, a quarter of an acre to half an acre in size, in a way that's basically supposed to mimic a small scale natural disturbance. And that's what we know, is that's the size of an opening that ash really needs to be successful. All right, who's next? Will Lintelak. Hey, Will.
Do you want to say thank you? Really quick?
Thank you.
Hi, Ethan. Thanks for hosting us.
Yeah, you bet, Will.
Hey, yeah, I had I guess I had a comment and then kind of a question.
Yeah.
Without being any particular to speak on the relationship of the Abenaki with ash trees, I just wanted to comment that there is a really important connection there between Abenaki tradition and ash trees. And that's actually a really big loss. That is a tree that, to the best of my knowledge, is essentially the tree of creation for those people, the tree of sort of their original inventor, and it's a really important part of basket making and basket weaving.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I guess I just had a question. I know that there are some cities, particularly I believe sort of along the Atlantic, all the way up into the Northeast, starting with Charleston, South Carolina. I know that even Northampton, Massachusetts has a city tree program where they're encouraging people, if they do need to replace a tree in their yard, a hedgerow, a sort of visual barrier, that it's not actually a native tree. It is a non-invasive. They're encouraging people to plant non-invasive, warmer climate plants in anticipation of a warming climate. In Northampton, Mass, instead of having people plant oak, maple, things like that you would generally find in a northern hardwood setting, they're encouraging people to plant, you know, like gum and tupelo and tulip poplar and things like that. And are there similar measures that we can or should be taking sort of outside of our landscaping and cityscaping needs at a larger forest landscape scale that might be kind of similar, just in anticipation of we might not totally be in control of retaining all of our native species, and how do we get ahead of that?
Yeah, so there's sort of a couple different parts to that. So one of them is that, thank you for also mentioning that, Will, because I'm usually, the work that I do is normally with white ash, but there are two other native ash species. One of them is black ash or brown ash, which is what you're talking about, which is an incredibly important tree for native species. And I know that the Abenaki and others have been working on how we address sort of culturally and artisanally, and as far as its use in basket making, the loss of that species. I know that Nancy Patch, who's the Franklin Grand Isle County Forester, has been working with them on that. But the other species, the ash species, that's probably going to be the sort of the biggest economic problem for our municipalities is also green ash, because there are just millions and millions of green ash trees all along our streets, and it's an incredibly important in terms of sort of abundant landscaping tree. And so that, you know, the planting of all these green ash trees is a huge problem. And then also green ash is a really important component of our floodplain and wetland ecosystem. So in the floodplains, we know that having these really diverse, healthy forests attenuate our floodwaters, which, you know, not only is sort of good for our infrastructure, but is also part of this really important system that maintains water quality and carbon storage and all these other things, and wildlife habitat. And so that is also a huge loss. But the black ash is certainly the most sort of culturally important tree in that way. As far as planting trees, you know, it's kind of funny. I like never, you know, all the forestry that I do in Vermont, for the most part, most of the forestry that we do relies on native regeneration. So we just like create an opportunity, and we have such an amazing, abundant, regenerating northern forest that the regeneration just kind of happens. And, you know, if you do all the right things, you know, you can sort of get this really amazing regeneration response. But one thing that I would say about, as far as planting trees, you know, well, so two things. So in the forest, you know, I think that there's this idea of assisted migration. And so people are like, we understand that our climate is going to be changing faster than our forests are able to change. And this idea that we could sort of introduce some of these southern species. I don't know a ton about assisted migration that I could sort of intelligently talk to you about in terms of what's a really nuanced way to think about it. I'm a little bit wary in general of introducing some species that we know to be invasive or that have the potential to become invasive. But I don't know that I could talk about sort of assisted migration in general. But I would say that as we're planting tree species, one thing that we should be learning, and if you come to my events and, like this and also in-person events that will hopefully resume at some point, you'll know that one thing that I always talk about is the importance of diversity in our forests. So diversity, we can almost use as a surrogate for the health of the forest, because it's influences the forest's ability to respond to a changing climate, influences the forest's ability to respond to natural disturbances that we expect to increase in severity, and also is just this really important thing that forests kind of do naturally. That's incredibly important. And so I think that we should take that principle also to our streets and to our areas where we're planting trees, where instead of what they did with green ash and Norway maple and others, found a tree that would survive and just planted it everywhere. Why don't we plant a bunch of different species so that we buffer ourselves from something like this happening again? And so I think that it's also, and use native species. And so I think it's something that makes a lot of sense from a, economic or pragmatic logistical point of view, because you're like, okay, we want to buffer ourselves from, this big economic loss, which and pain in the butt, which is happening right now with the emerald ash borer and our green ash trees. But then also, wouldn't it be nice if instead of you walk down the street and all the trees are the same, wouldn't it be nice if there's just all kinds of different interesting tree species that flower at different times in different ways and produce different kinds of seeds and have different bark? And I just think that's really cool. And then finally, I would think that a lot of the, to your point about, broader point about sort of how we manage forests for a changing climate, I think, there's a lot of good resources out there, especially produced by Tony D'Amato, who's right here at UVM, about managing forests for their resilience. And so one of the ways we do that is by managing them to be diverse. So diversity in this context means many different species of trees. It means also protecting rare, threatened, endangered, sensitive species. And it also means structural diversity, which is a term that most of us are less familiar with. If you've walked around with me, you're probably more familiar with it. But the idea is that we want to manage forests that have many different sizes and ages of trees. So we want some tall trees, some middle-sized trees, some young trees. And that's based on, encouraging diversity from just sort of managing our forests to be diverse, which we know is also linked to them being resilient to sort of whatever comes down the pike from climate change and other issues. And it's also just how forests grow naturally. And the forests we have are not like that. And that's largely because of human created situations. The fact that almost all of our forests, pretty much every forest you've probably ever been in, was a field in 1850. And while there has been an opportunity for trees to become somewhat old in the time since then, many of our forests are, only 50 or 60 years old as well. But forest systems develop over hundreds and thousands of years. And so we can infer from our study of remnant old growth forests and other things that the forests that were cut and cleared for agriculture in the 1800s were these massively complex systems, which featured many different ages and sizes of trees, and yes, old trees, but also pockets of young trees and a mix of all different shapes and sizes and species of trees. So what we know is that, sort of what it seems like to me is that everything that we do, every problem that we are trying to address with our forest points back to one thing, and that's diversity, and to looking to the way that forests manage themselves and understanding that a complex, healthy forested system is incredibly resilient. And in some cases, there's an opportunity for us to drive disturbances, to drive regeneration, and to encourage these forests to actually become more diverse sooner than they would naturally. And I think that's one of the ways that we're going to help forests be resilient to a changing climate. And then also in general, just thinking really hard about how we eliminate stressors. So doing other stuff that I talked about, like eliminate or controlling invasive exotic plants so that they're not interfering with our forest's ability to regenerate, which is really critical for them becoming diverse, because if they can't regenerate, then they can't create new age classes of trees and they can't be diverse. Same thing with addressing human-created problems like the overpopulation of white-tailed deer, which is a situation that we've created through our impact on the landscape. And, there's even things that we can do like, thinning around the trees, individual trees, basically when trees are competing with each other, selecting trees that are really high quality and healthy, and eliminating proactively cutting the trees that are competing with them, which will allow them to basically lower the stress of competing with the trees adjacent to them, which will give them more tools and more energy to respond to those other environmental stressors as our climate changes. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I think that there's an opportunity, like it's really scary for a lot of people to think about the human, how do we interject ourselves or get involved with our landscape in a way that's actually like altruistic and symbiotic and positive, because we have such a bad track record as human beings. In the last 300 years, we've done everything to this forest and somehow it's still here. But I think that there is a way that we can actually be a positive influence on the forest, and that's especially with respect to problems that we've created. Let's see here. Who else has got a question? I see another one from Kim. Kim, you want to ask another question? Kim Coleman?
I think that was just Nico pressing buttons.
Oh, good.
I've got a couple in the chat box, Ethan. So someone wanted to know a little bit more about carbon sequestration. They said there's been more talk about older forests for carbon sequestration. Is that part of current use management these days? And then there was also some question about old growth and wild forests and how that might fit into a UVA plan and ESTAs. Yeah.
So a couple of things about old growth, and I think about old growth all the time, and there's this sort of emergent field in forestry, especially especially headed up by a couple amazing foresters, forest ecologists from the University of Vermont. That's Bill Keaton and Tony D'Amato, who I've already mentioned a couple of times. And they are thinking about how we sort of actively create these old growth structures using management. So basically, pushing forests into that old growth condition sooner than they would be able to naturally, and understanding that will provide all this incredible diversity across our landscape. As far as carbon sequestration and storage, we know that multi-aged forests, so forests which are, like I'm talking about, have a high degree of structural diversity, trees of different sizes and ages, in general store more carbon than even-aged forests. Even-aged forests are forests where all the trees are about the same size and age. This is what, by far, most of our forests are, because they've originated essentially from pasture abandonment, in some cases, but from aggressive logging as well. And so we know that those store more carbon than even-aged forests. We also know that because multi-aged forests are more resilient to disturbances, especially more resilient to these like huge landscape scale giant disturbances than even-aged forests, that were buffered from what happens when a huge area of forest blows over. So in many cases, all your trees are the same size, all your trees are the same age, maybe they're even the same species, maybe it's a plantation. And what happens when a big windstorm comes is, instead of knocking over a few trees, it takes them all. So there's a really amazing place on the Heinsberg Town Forest, a blowdown that is 40 acres in size, and that is the exact footprint of an old plantation. And so while that 40-acre area is actually really interesting, it created this huge block of young forest, which is a really underrepresented forest type across our landscape. What happens is that most of the carbon that's in that forest, as much as 60% of it, is in the soils, and the rest of it is in the living trees and stuff like that. And so when a huge area like that blows down, what happens is that as those trees rot, as the organic material in the soil breaks down, as it will in those big disturbances, you're basically creating carbon dioxide from all this carbon that was fixed in the trunk of those trees and also in the soils. And so creating more diverse, resilient forests, while it will lead probably to, over the short term, to a little bit of a release of carbon. You know, we're going to be cutting trees, we're going to be creating openings. Some of, you know, the carbon in those trees and the carbon in those openings will be released. Over time, you're going to buffer yourself from those large scale disturbances. And that's exactly, you know, that's just what old forests do. It's just that we have, you know, sort of this landscape that is not like old forests very much, and so is subject to these more intensive disturbances. And so I'm just really excited about, you know, the other thing I would say is that if you're looking solely at carbon, this is a lot of this stuff is just really nuanced, and so it's you can't just like think about it once and then like put it away and you never have to think about it again. If you're thinking solely about carbon, the best thing that you could do, just solely, you know, I'm trying to sequester and store as much carbon as possible, is to just do nothing. So over time, you'll see that the total carbon in a forest will just increase as that forest develops. However, what you're not accounting for is you're not accounting for buffering against these large-scale disturbances, and you're not accounting for other sort of less quantitative and more qualitative aspects of the work that we do. So I'm thinking about, at the same time that I'm like, yes, I want to store as much carbon as we possibly can, I also want to like create really good habitat, you know, and really good habitat might require us to do a little bit of intervention to create those structurally diverse forests. And, you know, even in some cases, you know, we know that in addition to our forests not being like our pre-European settlement forests likely were, our whole landscape isn't like that yet. And we haven't had time to sort of develop the natural disturbance patterns that would be endemic to our forested landscape if we'd been here 300 years ago. And so stuff like pockets of young forest, you know, even these big openings, even if that means that, you know, in the short term that we are losing a little bit of carbon from that system, we're also creating habitat for native species of birds like ruffed grouse and woodcock. And so, you know, I think that those species have a place on our landscape, even if it doesn't mean that, you know, we're sequestering the maximum total tons of carbon per acre on every single acre. So it's really complicated, because what we know, in addition to the climate changing, yes, we need to sequester and store as much carbon as possible, but we also know that other elements of our landscape that have value are under threat. And so that includes our wildlife species. And I think that I actually learned a lot. I went to a discussion about restoring stream channels, because in stream ecology, they have very similar problems where, because of what people have done to streams over time, they just have, you know, these problems that are very difficult to overcome. Stream channels have been straightened, and they've been deepened, and they've been rerouted. You know, all this different stuff has happened that has prevented them from being sort of this normal meandering stream, which we also know to be more resilient and to you know, big flooding events, and ultimately better for our water quality and stuff like that. But they recognize that in order to get that stream to a point that they call equilibrium, so that's a level at which it has restored its natural meanders and is actually a much more stable condition, it will require erosion to get us there a little bit. So like, you know, I think of the work that we do with forest management for carbon as being, it will require the release of a small amount of carbon through the work that we're doing in order to get us to a place that will ultimately be like a long-term, way more stable and way more sort of abundant place for storing carbon in the future, in addition to providing all this other stuff like really, really great wildlife habitat, which I think is also qualitatively important on our landscape. As far as the old, you know, getting into the nuances of the UVA program a little bit about the old forest category. So there's, within the current use program, the program was started in the late 70s, early 80s. And the goal was a bunch of different stuff: preventing land from becoming developed, improving the quality of forest management on the land that we have, a bunch of different other stuff. and supporting the working landscape. And so one of the other things that is required on current use enrolled lands is that it is managed actively in some way. And so manage actively for the production of timber, for the production of these forest products. And so, you know, that worked for a long time. And then I don't know exactly when it happened in the 2000s. People said, well, geez, there's also these areas that also have value that the management of them would be enriched by not managing them. And so they created this category that you're allowed to have within current use enrollments called the ESTAs, the Ecologically Significant Treatment Areas. And so these are areas like forested wetlands, rare, threatened, endangered species habitat, and vernal pools and stuff like that, where it's recognized that it's providing landscape value. It's really, really important. It should be conserved and not just kicked out of current use because we're not managing timber there. But that also, the best management for those areas is no management, or is not, strictly speaking, timber management, I should say. There is also a category that is old forest. So old forest is an area that has basically been undisturbed by people, by our management for a long period of time. And that is also eligible to be an ESTA. However, there's this weird thing where you have to manage your land for timber and, you know, or manage it actively for the production of forest products. And at the same time, you know, you have this old forest category, but you're not really allowed to allow your forest just to grow to get into the old forest category. I don't have an answer for how we do that. Yeah, I know you asked the question. I don't have an answer for that. It's something that we're thinking about because we recognize that old forests are really important, and we want to have old forests on our landscape, and we also want to support a vibrant working landscape for we want to have all those things. And so it's something we're addressing. I don't have an answer for exactly what the answer is right now, but we're trying to figure it out.
Okay, well, we have reached our 10 o'clock hour, and as you can see, Ethan can continue sharing a lot about forests, and he really only touched on some topics. There were questions on floodplain forests, questions on wildlife, question in their forests, and so we hope to do some more of these. So please watch for that. We also will have a tree ID class that Ethan will be doing next Thursday night from 7 to 8, also a Zoom call. You can email, I put Ethan's email in the chat box, and you can email questions ahead of time to Ethan if you'd like to be on that call so we can answer some of those questions. And thank you all for joining in today. This is really, really exciting. And, you know, for our kickoff event, you know, it was fun. So Kathleen, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to say that Kyle Mason actually has raised his hand to do one of these for us.
Oh, good.
Oh, great.
Next Friday morning at 9 a.m. Not to boot you out, Ethan. We'll give you another chance, but Kyle wants to jump in here.
Good.
Too.
Yeah, Kyle Mason, who's the Rutland County Forester.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would also say that we're going to continue, especially during this time, we're going to continue to try and provide programming and opportunities for you guys to learn and ask questions and enrich your understanding of forests and our ecosystems and their management. So if you want, I would recommend getting in touch with Vermont Coverts, VWA, and other conservation organizations like Audubon Vermont, Vermont Land Trust, Nature Conservancy. We're all just trying to figure out how to make the most of this time. And and if you want to be on my email list, you can just email me at the email that's in the chat box, and I will put you on there. And so yeah, stay tuned. I also have another, excuse me, in addition to that presentation on Tree ID on Thursday, I have a presentation on Tuesday, which I call backyard stewardship, which is just about managing smaller sort of backyard lots and placing that in a broader landscape context.
Just let me interrupt a second, Ethan, that all the other organizations that are going to put on these kind of webinars like that is, if I'm on your list, which I just got on, that will they show up on your list and I'll get notifications of Kathleen's? And
Yeah, I'll
Is it-
share. I'll share all kinds of different stuff.
Okay, that's good.
I won't.
Thank
I
you,
hopefully won't overshare or overuse that email list to the point where it's annoying. But I'll definitely share stuff that's related to forests and forestry that I think you'll find interesting.
And you can also sign up for e-news from Vermont Woodlands on our website and Lisa on yours as well.
Yeah, we're getting that link up there, or they can just email me directly. I'm also updating our calendar, which used to have all the public events and woods walks on the calendar. They will now all be populated with these kinds of events. So if you go to the calendar, you can look and see that, oh, there's a webinar or a Zoom call today on a certain topic.
Mm-hmm. And I would just say that this is probably a great time, at least for me, when things maybe are a little different, a little slower, to think about Aldo Leopold, his land ethic and his mantra to observe, participate, and reflect. Something I never have time to do. So this is the time.
Thank you all.
Thank you, buddy.
Nice to see you.
It's been great.